Chaebols refer to family-owned and controlled conglomerates that dominate the Korean business world. They often come under fire for their collusion with the government or involvement in corruption scandals. Now, there are growing calls for reform or even dissolution of the chaebol system. On this week's Upfront, we discuss the potential directions for chaebol reform.
In February, the vice chairman and heir apparent of Korean electronics conglomerate Samsung, Lee Jae-yong, was placed under arrest. He was accused of offering a bribe of more than $38 million to former President Park Geun-hye. He's now at the epicenter of the influence peddling scandal involving Choi Soon-sil that erupted last year. At a parliamentary inquiry into the power abuse scandal held last December, some of the most powerful figures in the Korean corporate world, including Lee, were grilled by a bipartisan committee. Investigations into conglomerates, including SK and Lotte, are still ongoing.
재판관 전원의 일치된 의견으로 주문을 선고합니다. 주문, 피청구인 대통령 박근혜를 파면한다.
Meanwhile, President Park was ousted, becoming the nation's first president to be removed from office. Korea's conglomerates, or chaebols, that once helped transform the country into an industrial power, disappointed the public with their cozy ties with the government and subsequent corruption. Korea is not new to collusion between politics and business, which in the latest case rattled the nation. Chaebol businesses and the government have long maintained a back-scratching alliance based on mutual interests. In the run-up to the early presidential elections scheduled in May, the demand for chaebol reform is growing. Can chaebols once again become the driving force behind Korea's growth this time by playing fair? In this week's Upfront, we discuss what directions chaebol reform efforts should take.
For today's discussion, we are joined by two experts. Shin Se-don, professor of economics at Sookmyung Women's University, and Park Sang-in, professor at Seoul National University's Graduate School of Public Administration. Thank you very much for joining us today. The recent political scandal that led to the impeachment of Park Geun-hye has also triggered a prosecution probe into several chaebol groups, including Samsung, Lotte, and SK. Now, the de facto leader of Samsung is behind bars already, and there could be others to follow. Do you see these conglomerates as victims or perpetrators in this scandal?
Well, it may be interesting to view one party victim, the other perpetrator, but as far as I am concerned, both the government, in this case the Blue House, and the number of chaebols in this country are kind of forming a symbiotic unity. Mm-hmm. So they are kind of complice in the sense that they did all the scandals together. So it's, I think, unfair to call one side victim, the other side perpetrator.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, we agree with Professor Sin, and I guess Samsung is a kind of bribe giver, and the ex-president Park and her friend Choi Soon-sil was a bribe taker. So there was a good reason for Samsung to give the bribe to the government, because the Samsung is in the process of the succession to Lee Jae-yong, and they need lots of favors from the government.
Now, what defines chaebol? What sets Korean chaebols apart from conglomerates found in other countries?
Well, it's very difficult and very philosophical question to answer that. But as far as the so-called chaebols in Korean corporation environment, we could distinguish certain kind of characteristics. First, they form very numerous subsidiaries as a fleet, or we can call it octopus-like formation of corporate structure. And the other one is, in reality, the ownership is very weak. For example, Chairman Lee Geun-hye or Deputy Chairman Lee Jae-yong only has less than 5% of ownership, but actually he control entire $1 trillion of worth of the company. So relatively speaking, the ownership is surprisingly low, and their power of concentration is kind of unthinkably high. So that's, I think, the characteristics that define Korean conglomerates. Has numerous subsidiaries and a very small actual ownership, but actually having a very surprisingly high control of the entire group. That defines Korean chaebols.
How is it possible to exert so much control over the group when their ownership is so little?
That is the essence of the trouble. What we call in Korean corporate structure, we call it mutual capitalization. In Korean, 상호출자, or circular capitalization, 순환출자. So he actually owns a small portion of a company, but that company has another small portion ownership of another company. That process continues on a circular manner, and that gives Mr. E or other chairman in the chaebol environment has a huge control of entire group.
I guess, it is very important to distinguish chaebol from the large companies. The large company means a single company with lots of assets and sales, etc., right? However, chaebol means large business group controlled by the owner family. So it is about the business group, large business group, and the business group is controlled by the single family. So the many chaebol problem or issue occur because of the single family's control of large business group with small share, as he mentioned, right? So the chaebol use lots of the schemes like circular shareholding, which is indirect cross shareholding, and the direct cross shareholding is prohibited by corporate law in Korea. So indirect cross shareholding, which is called circular shareholding in Korean, is kind of loophole of the system. So also we have a holding company system regulation, which has lots of loophole as well. So the chaebol owner family use that kind of loopholes in the law, and they basically controlled with the other affiliate owns money. So with only 5% of share, they act like emperor over all the entire affiliate firms. The chaebol regulation of Korea has focused on two things. The first one is corporate governance issues, which means how to prevent the emperor-style governance of the chaebol owner family. The second one is, as you mentioned, the protection of small and medium-sized enterprises. So, however, for the last 10 years, we have witnessed all these chaebol regulations and policies eventually failed. Because the reason is, we didn't touch the fundamentals. The fundamental of chaebol issue is the concentration of economic power by single family. So the concentration of economic power made everything possible. So make the owner family evade any strict punishment by the law. They make lots of influence on politics and media, etc. All these are possible because of concentration of economic power. However, for the last 10 years, the Korean government virtually didn't do anything about dissolve or curb the concentration of economic power by the chaebol owner family. So that is the reason the regulations on chaebol has been failed so far.
Well, years of failed attempts at chaebol reform and the never-ending collusion between the corporate sector and government have left the Korean public disappointed. We took to the streets to hear what people think about chaebols in general and about the chaebol-centered economy. Take a look.
According to a survey conducted earlier this year, 2 in 3 Koreans believe the country's chaebol-centered system is not beneficial to individuals and the Korean economy as a whole. Upfront went out on the street to hear what people have to say about the chaebol system.
너무 자기네들 자산 불리기에만 좀 집중하고 있지 않냐.
시장 경제에서 아예 없는 거는 생각할 수는 없는 것 같고요.
그런 집안의 어떤 사리사욕이나 어떤 그런 걸 위해서 존재를 하고 그리고 일단은 기본적으로 공정하지 않다는 거
힘이 있는 그룹이 있을 때 추진력 있게 그 어느 정도 사업을 진행을 하고 그를 기반으로 이제 일반적인 기업에 비해서 좀 더 그 돈을 벌기 쉽다고 생각을 합니다.
공정하지 못하고 자신들이 가지고 있는 권력을 남용하고 있는 문제들이 제일 문제라고 생각을 합니다.
So we've heard various opinions from people on the streets. Now, there have always been pros and cons about chaebol. I'd like to hear your take on this. Do you think the chaebol structure is beneficial or harmful to the Korean economy?
Viewing chaebol problem in terms of whether pros are bigger than cons, I think it's not the issue. The issue is the fairness. The issue is lawfulness. So whether chaebol or not, or big or small, when they commit something unlawful and unfair to the system, it's got to be, penalized. It's got to be punished. And always, the issue of, Samsung has been creating a smartphone, Hyundai Motor Corporations having producing a lot of automobile and make Korean economy moving. So that doesn't tell anything about, the justification of the company. So issue is not whether, Samsung has been beneficial to our economy or not. The issue is whether they've conducted some unlawful things. If they did, they got to be punished. And usually, then they didn't. They weren't punished. That was the critical issue. So
Well, I partially agree with him in the sense, our judicial system and our politicians and the bureaucrats and the media are all on the influence, heavy influence of a Korean chaebol owner family. So they do not serve the justice to the society. So that is why people are so angry about it. And but my question is then, what should we do to correct that kind of systemic failure in politics, judiciary area, and the media, etc.? We have to know what is the main cause of those kind of over influence of chaebol owner family. That is so-called concentration of economic power. So in late 19th century and early 20th century, there was a progress movement in United States, and they voiced a worry about concentration of economic power by Rockefeller and others, and they defined the concentration of economic power as the existence of gatekeeper. So the Korean chaebol owner family is the gatekeeper. So they use not their own money, actually, the company's money, shareholders' money, to have influence on all social and political decision making. And they take all the private benefit from the system, and they evaded any proper legal punishment at all, right? So that is all the kind of superficial kind of phenomenon. My point is to change that kind of things and correct the wrongdoings and the misconducts, etc., we need to have some fundamental remedy, which is basically dissolution of concentration of economic power, which is not totally equal to the dissolution of chaebol system itself. So we should be careful about that.
Let's take a look at how other countries did it. We know that countries like Japan, Israel, and the US once had large corporate entities, much like Korea's chaebols, but they were dissolved or broken up by the government or through regulations. Can you tell us about some of the successful or unsuccessful attempts at dismantling?
Right. In 2013, very recent one, there is a reform done in the peacetime. So in Israeli case, they has focused on two things. The first one is the ownership structure. They restrict the ownership structure into two public layers. That is it. And they also imposed on separation between financial and non-financial large entities. So with this structural remedy and the corporate governance reform as well, so they have been successful in reducing and curbing the concentration of economic power, the chaebol, and change the society and the economic structure more competitive and more productive. So the aim for the chaebol reform in Israel is that it is promotion of the market economy and it is promotion of democracy. So chaebol reform, actually in Israel, the reform was done by the right-wing government, not the left-wing government. So they understood that the concentration of economic power cannot go with the market economy, it cannot go with democracy. So I guess, in Korea, we have a very serious concentration of economic power. It is more difficult for us actually have meaningful reform compared to the case of Israel.
Will they work for Korea?
Well, the point that I want to make, I remember when I was studying in the States in 1970, telephone company was a huge giant. And at the time, the Congress wanted to split the giant bell into small bell company. Issue in the United States, for example, is not kind of unlawful practices of the chaebol. The issue was monopoly. So they wanted to desegregate the big company into pieces. So in that respect, I think that was success. But here, even chaebol is dissolved into a small company. Still, if the judiciary system is influenced by a kind of small family owners, still, chaebol exerts a very important power and influence on the soul. The issue of dissolution of chaebol or big company in the States is totally different from the issue in chaebol. Here, we're talking about the unlawful and unfair practices of some giant company. But that was not the issue in the United States mostly. In 1930s or even 1970s, the U.S., the issue was anti-monopoly, antitrust activity. And that was a kind of a formation problem. But here, it's kind of unethical, practices of the, so totally, I think, different.
I think, the example the Professor Shin gave is not actually relevant one. So the breakup of AT&T is the antitrust issue, right? So, however, in 1920s and 1930s, U.S. also have chaebols, huge business group controlled by the family. So
Standard Oil.
Standard Oil was not a chaebol, it was trust. So trust and the chaebols are two different things.
Okay.
Trust, in case of Standard Oil, they used antitrust, the Sherman Act, to break up the Standard Oil. However, in 20s and 30s, they have chaebol, the business group, which has operation in variety of the industries. So they could not apply the standard Sherman Act to the chaebol issue there. So during the New Deal era, President Roosevelt introduced lots of laws to curb and dissolve the concentration of economic power. So at the end of the day, by 1950 and 1960, in the U.S. there is no chaebol, and they all basically stand-alone companies. So from 1960s in the United States, chaebol and concentration of economic power was not anymore the public policy issue. So that was all about the monopolization issues. So there is two different things. So, but in case of, as I mentioned, Israel, it was not just the concentration, not just monopolization issue. It was concentration of economic power issue. They studied the New Deal policies and the policies during the occupation, U.S. occupation in Japan and Germany very closely. They end up with a very nice and smart plan, very well fit into their own situation. I believe we can do the kind of similar thing. So we have learned even from the Israel. So we can design the policy which is very appropriate to the Korean situation. The issue here is not the policy technicality. It is issue of the political will.
I think Professor Shin is not against chaebol reform per se.
Yeah, I understand, Professor Park's argument, late 20th and early 21st century business environment in the States, but United States is very different from Korea because, as long as business is concerned in the United States, state is the country. So in order to exert business operation from one state to another, it's strictly controlled by the state, trade commission. So in that kind of environment, something like, company like Samsung or Hyundai Motor Corporation could not exist in tightly state control the business environment in the States. So I don't know. I don't know very much about the Israeli problem, Israeli the way, but we need the structure change per se in order to prevent kind of economic concentration. But Professor Park mentioned the political will, but I don't think that's enough. Political will has been more than enough for the last 3 decades. The problem is legal process and constitutional process and the cultural process. We know that Korean business culture, kind of a personal tie is so important. Personal relation connection is more important than anything else. So in that kind of environment, I think political will of removing concentration of power, may not be enough.
So, Professor Park, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to changing the current situation?
Well, it is the concentration of economic power by the chaebol. Chaebol is so powerful. They have influence on, the legal system. They have influence on the National Assembly, enactment system. They have influence on media. They have influence on academia as well. So they have hands on everywhere. So I guess there is the reason why it is so difficult to have the fundamental reform in chaebol. But for the reform, we need a certain momentum, right? So I believe the so-called the 박근혜 최순실 gate gave the momentum for the reform. So I guess if new president and the new government decide to have fundamental change in the Korean economy system, which is really old one. It's chaebol's central economy, which is not the innovation-based economy. So moving from the old chaebol central economy to the innovation-based economy, we also need the chaebol reform. There is the fundamental structural change as well. However, I guess if the government has the deep understanding and the will, and I think we have momentum. So this is the kind of window of opportunity for the fundamental change. However, I'm afraid that if we miss this windows of opportunity, probably we may not have another opportunity in the future. I'm very pessimistic in this sense. So as Professor Shin mentioned, the legal system very important, but there is consequences, in my opinion. There is the consequences of the concentration of economic power by the chaebol. Without dissolving the concentration of economic power by chaebol, I guess we cannot have the very independent legal system, very independent media, very independent politics and policy making at all. So that is not sufficient condition. Chaebol reform is not a sufficient condition, but it is a necessary condition. So without that, nothing can be done, in my opinion.
Yes, it seems there is widespread public distrust against chaebols in Korea. So in the meantime, what can chaebols do to regain the trust of the public and consumers?
Well, my point about the problem associated with chaebol is righteousness, fairness, and lawfulness. And they have been conducting so many unlawful and unfair practices for the more than several decades. So it's going to take a long time for them to do lawful things, fair things, and make people believe and have trust in their behavior. It's not, the people don't want their lip services anymore. They want their action. So it's going to take more than decades for those, the company, big company, so-called chaebols, have to transform their activities. Always when they make decisions, they have to think about whether this is lawful, whether this is fair, whether this is, giving trust to the people. Not just making money or profit should not be their sole goal. So they have to transform. Basically, they have to transform into ethical, at least a minimally ethical entity, and we have to wait more than several years for them to really change it. And otherwise, I think people will not give any trust into those chaebol corporations so far.
Well, we have to wrap up our discussion. Thank you very much, Professor Shin and Professor Park, for sharing your insights with us today. With growing calls and expectations for chaebol reform, it may be time for some realistic and concrete change in Korea's corporate structure. Let's keep a close eye on future developments. That's all for this week. Upfront will be back next week. Thanks for watching.